No, I think I should give a few more minutes. I still see people. Right. Welcome, everybody. Is that too loud? Sounds too loud to me. Welcome. I did not know how many people were going to be here. I told Amidah Israel, who works here and does a lot here, I told her that I had a dream the other night that I walked up here and nobody was here. So I ran into her office and I said, make sure we have cake, because I know we'll get 15 or 20 people that way. Just a couple ground rules before I introduce Stephen Fried, our speaker. The way we're going to do the Q&A afterwards is that David and Lenore are going to be at the end of rows with cards, and you'll write the questions down. The questions will come up here, and that's how we'll answer them. So before I introduce Stephen Fried, who I believe is one of this country's great nonfiction writers, and he lives right here in Center City, Philadelphia, I want to thank a few people for making this evening possible. First of all, our rabbis, Rosen and Yanoff, have been very, I said we want to do this. Stephen and I had started talking a lot. I'm going to go back through the background of that. And they've been so supportive about having this evening take place and know how important this is. I want to thank Lauren Marks Cabanas. She does everything basically here. Amidah Israel. Sean Cuff, who is, the rooms are always prepared the right way. We've had some of the great programming I've seen here, and that's Lenore Asbell and Pam Lashner who take care of that. My wife, Janine Cohen, who can't be here, she's out in Ohio now, and Dave Steinman have done a lot of work to make sure that this night is the start of this discussion about mental health, not the end. And so there's going to be a lot more going on. Someone will come up later to speak about mental health first aid, which we'll be beginning. So I want to go back to how this idea took root. I read the book A Common Struggle about a year ago. I think it had just come out a few months before. It's a book about Patrick Kennedy's struggles with bipolar disease and addiction. It was co-written by Patrick and our guest tonight, Stephen Fried. So when I saw that Stephen and Patrick were speaking at Rodef Shalom, April or May, I'm going to say, Janine and I decided to go, and at the very end, it was great. I was fascinated by the book, just as fascinated by the talk. And at the end, I went up to say hello to Stephen, who is a hometown friend, maybe a few years younger than me, but we knew each other. Our families knew each other. And a few days later, I see a private message from Stephen. He'd like to talk. And I had no idea. We both play in old man basketball leagues. I think we were going to discuss a merger or something. I didn't know anything. But he wanted to talk about my brother's suicide on Yom Kippur, September 18th, 1972. And I think the first conversation, we spoke for close to an hour. And I learned shortly after that he wanted to make an article out of it. And he'll remember that my initial response was that I didn't think I wanted to do that. But I went to Janine and we spoke, and Janine said 4 words: you could help somebody. So we decided to do it. There was an article. It's available in the back. If you haven't read it, it's from the foreword. He wrote it in a very sensitive and caring and compassionate way. And I'd have to say that there's few things that you can say that are life-changing, but that's one of them. So this is the first step, as I said, in a long process that we think will help people to come out and talk about mental health and get some help through their faith communities. I also want to dedicate this evening to my parents. I think the hardest thing in the world must be to lose a child. They lost 2. The first thing they would say is, he's a synagogue president? I didn't see that one coming at all. But I think ultimately they would be really thankful and proud that something that was so tragic could turn out to be something that's good. So without any further ado, I want to introduce Stephen Fried to you. Stephen is an award-winning journalist and best-selling author who teaches at Columbia University Graduate School as well as the University of Pennsylvania. He lectures widely all over the country. Most recently, he was the author with Patrick Kennedy of the New York Times bestseller, A Common Struggle. He is also the author of 5 other nonfiction books, including 2 specifically that deal with healthcare, mental illness, and addiction. Thing of Beauty, The Tragedy of Supermodel Gia, which was turned into an HBO film, which was one of Angelina Jolie's first movies. Bitter Pills, Inside the Hazardous Worlds of Legal Drugs, which triggered an FDA inquiry into the brain health safety of antibiotics. He wrote The New Rabbi. He wrote Appetite for America, Fred Harvey, and the Business of Civilizing the Wild West, One Meal at a Time. And then he wrote an essay collection called Husbandry. Stephen has been a staff writer at Vanity Fair, GQ, and Glamour, as well as Philadelphia Magazine, where during his 18-year tenure, he won 2 National Magazine Awards and also served as editor-in-chief. He does editorial consulting in a variety of journalistic and healthcare settings, Currently, he serves as a consultant to the Kennedy Forum and the new WHYY Scattergood Foundation Behavioral Health Journalism series. Stephen lives in Center City with his wife, Diane Ayers, who's also with us tonight. He's currently writing a biography of Benjamin Rush, the founding father of American medicine and mental health care for Crown. So please give a warm welcome to Stephen Freed.
Elliot moved my slides forward, so we'll start over. First of all, I just want to thank Elliot for his openness. This all grew out of just a conversation that had been waiting for many, many years to be had for both of us. But whenever anybody, I wish that we lived in a world where you didn't have to be brave to talk openly about mental illness and addiction and completed suicide and overdose. And maybe we can make that a little bit better, but it still, unfortunately, requires way too much bravery. So, as Elliot was saying, last spring, Patrick Kennedy and I spoke at a synagogue in Center City. We were discussing our book. We were talking about important national political issues in mental illness and substance use, medical discrimination, stigma, insurance parity, all the big picture social action stuff that we have been brought in to discuss. But as I talked, I also found myself thinking about something just a lot more personal. I wondered, what messages do we send in our congregations and in our faith communities every day about mental illness and addiction and those who have them? We always say that we understand that these are medical conditions, but at a very personal level, do we really act that way? Do we believe in praying to heal diseases of the brain the same way that we believe in praying for all other diseases? Do we believe in mourning deaths from tragic outcomes from these illnesses, suicides, overdoses, the same way we do for other diseases? Do we regularly include them in the health and wellness that we pray for and wish for? Do our clergy and community members offer hospital, home medical visits for these illnesses? And if not, why the hell not? There's ample evidence that these diseases are like all others for which we offer all of our sincerest sympathies. The theories we were taught that these are illnesses that were caused by faulty parenting or reflect weakness or failure and cannot be viewed and treated medically have been debunked. So why do we still whisper about mental illness and addiction the way we used to whisper about cancer? When we talk out loud about these diseases, why do we think it's okay to call people crazy? Suggest it's their families that are to blame for their, and not their illnesses, make fun of their treatments, make light of their caregivers. More than half the people who have been diagnosed with any mental illness do not get treatment at all, in part because they are too embarrassed and stigmatized to start treatment or stay with treatment. And given the stigma, if I was to go ahead and mention in a Amidah Prayer the name of somebody who was sick with one of these illnesses, would I really be welcoming sympathy for them, or would I be opening them up for second guessing and even criticism? And as I was thinking about all this, and I don't want to pretend that there are easy answers to these questions, I just don't think we wrestle with them enough. All the consumers, caregivers, clergy, and family members who are here in this room certainly will attest to that. I had an eerie experience. I looked away from Patrick and out into the audience the way I was taught when I was writing the new rabbi that you're supposed to scan like this. And I looked out and I saw a ghost. Actually, it was the brother of a ghost. It was Elliot. In 1972, when I was 14, it was Elliot's brother who had introduced me and basically everyone I knew to the concept of mental illness by completing suicide on Yom Kippur after his father had already left early for shul, but just in time for his mother and Elliot to discover him. By the time the families were recovering all over my hometown of Harrisburg to break the fast that evening, Siggy Miller's death was all that anyone talked about. And then nobody ever talked about it again. It took me 34 years to get up the courage to ask Elliot about his brother's death, which I finally did, triggered by that evening in Center City. After we spoke really honestly, he gave me permission to reach out to our rabbi from that time, Jeff Wolberg, who was also very open. And when I started thinking about what I could write that might jumpstart a conversation about changing the way our faith communities approach these illnesses, if they approach them publicly at all. And I'm not looking for a panacea or utopian solution. I don't want to insult people who work in these fields every day and say that there's something some journalist can talk about that's going to snap everything and change it. But I am looking for nothing more than parity, equality, acknowledgement of these illnesses, and support. It is hard to have any chronic illness in this country, and it's hard to help anyone with a chronic disease. My dad had heart disease and died of cancer. My mom has cancer. My brother has been diabetic since he was 9. These diseases get our respect and sympathy, and at least predictably, crappy to average medical coverage. My wife has epilepsy, which, because it is a brain disease, comes with certain stigma and fear attached. But when she was originally diagnosed after an adverse reaction to an antibiotic caused a seizure and a mood disorder symptom, she was treated initially by mental health professionals with all the discrimination, unfair deductibles, managed care challenges. Then she had several more seizures and started being treated primarily by neurologists for epilepsy, and suddenly our healthcare provider was calling all the time to see how she was. They couldn't wait to help her with her illness. Family members seemed suddenly more supportive of her care. Nobody asked if she still really had to keep taking those drugs or keep going to the doctor, even though, ironically, she was taking the same exact drugs that she took for bipolar disorder, which are anticonvulsants. This is where I think we can do better. During the course of my conversations with Elliot, which led to me to be invited here this evening, he asked about the journalism that I had done on this subject, some of which he had read. And he was realizing, I think, that more than he had realized had been inspired by my inability to learn more about his brother's story. And he asked if I would talk a little bit about some of these pieces, so I will. When I was coming up in journalism, most of my peers, inspired by In Cold Blood, wanted to solve murders. And I always wanted to solve suicides and explore mental illness and substance use disorders. My parents were a little freaked out about this as it becoming one of my specialties, but I did and I still do consider it a privilege to be able to do these kinds of stories. They are, I hope, darkly optimistic. They're meant to be cautionary tales that venture deep enough to see how these illnesses could have been diagnosed and treated, the secrets safely revealed, and the destruction perhaps averted. So this was my first major story at Philadelphia Magazine in 1984 about 5 teens in a small town in Upper Bucks County, 3 of whom completed suicide. 2 boys, a pastor's son and his best friend, jumped off a cliff handcuffed together after taking 11 hits of acid each, leaving a tape recorder running after covering their last hours of conversation and their last moments. And then several months later, the girlfriend of the pastor's son shot herself with her father's gun. I spent months recreating their lives and their deaths, along with the lives of their families, their teachers. Their therapists were given the right to break confidentiality to talk about what had gone right and wrong in their treatment. And after months of investigation, I thought I knew pretty much everything about their lives. So I was surprised 2 years later to go back to the same town and find out that the police chief who I'd interviewed for the story was a pedophile who'd been sexually abusing many young men in the town. And one of the main characters that I had interviewed for the piece was one of his victims. It was probably good this happened early in my career. It's good to have investigative humility brought upon you when you're young, especially when it comes to mental health stories, which really are hard to get to the heart of. But in this case, it was good because since I knew these people, they talked to me. So even the guy who was a sexual abuser felt that it was important for his side of the story to be told, and this was in the 1980s and continues to be today one of the only stories about child sexual abuse where the abuser is completely open and all his victims are all completely open. So it's hard work, but important work, and I was glad to be able to do it. I then stumbled into the tragic life of model Gia Karanji, which is a story that everyone thought was about how the fashion business destroyed an innocent young girl, and turned out to be a story about how a young woman who suffered from mental illness and addiction before she ever became a model went on to self-destruct on the international stage. I covered all her treatment. She actually had excellent treatment. She kicked heroin, and one of the first people who actually documented the medication-assisted therapy, and then unfortunately died of AIDS. She had what in the field was then called dual diagnosis. That was considered pretty rare then. I think that we now view dual diagnosis as something that's an artifact of the past, and we really view addiction and mental illness together in a whole new way. If you don't see it that way, I'm here to sort of help talk you into seeing it that way, because that's really the new cutting edge of how we see these things. And I probably overemphasize family dynamics over medical illness. And one of the things I want to talk to you about is how dangerous that is. I remember when I first talked about doing this story on Elliot's brother, somebody I knew from Harrisburg said, well, he hung himself as a big screw you to his dad. Like, that's why people complete suicide. Now, I'm sure that she said that thinking that that was a brilliant family dynamic observation, but those kinds of observations and those kinds of feelings, not understanding that these are medical illnesses, are really powerful, really horrible, and people can die from them. I think journalists sometimes don't understand that they can overemphasize family dynamics because they are dramatic, and avoid underlying illness because underlying illness isn't as dramatic. So I think that that's something, when I look back on the work that I did on Gia, I may be a little guilty of that. I then did a piece, which I mentioned earlier, about my wife having an adverse drug reaction, which drove me into the world of neurology, psychiatry, and also learning more than anybody should know about the Food and Drug Administration. But by that time, I was really interested in mental health care, and I realized there was very little good journalism going on in this area, very little dramatic journalism. So there was a lot of well-meaning journalism that I wouldn't read, but there wasn't much that was really engaging and that really showed what people went through. So I put myself through an enterprise, and some of the people here, mental health professionals, may remember this. I basically lived at the Institute of Pennsylvania Hospital for a year, trying to figure out everything they did there. And the Institute of Pennsylvania Hospital, which used to be at 49th Street, was like a department store of mental health care. They had every kind of mental health professional there. They had every kind of patient there. It was the first psychiatric institution of its kind in America. It's the birthplace of the American Psychiatric Association. And I spent an entire year there interviewing patients, interviewing professionals, and really trying to understand everything I could about mental health care. At the same time, during this time, I met Kay Jamison. How many of you have read Kay Jamison's book? Okay, so Kay Jamison is wrote the greatest book ever written about mood disorders, basically. When we met her, my wife was interested because she had been treated for some mood disorders, and she was reading the textbook of manic depressive illness that Kay Jamison had written. So I got an assignment to write about Kay Jamison so we could meet her, pretty much. And I knew nothing about her personal life, and after the first interview, which actually happened here in Philadelphia on the day that Kurt Cobain died, and she had never heard of Kurt Cobain, so I had to explain to her who Kurt Cobain was. Afterwards, she called me and she asked if she could talk to me off the record, and she explained that she had bipolar disorder, that she had never told anybody about this, but she was thinking about publishing a memoir about this, and she thought that perhaps she should come out to me first in the Washington Post, which I thought was cool. So, in fact, the first time that she ever talked openly about having the illness was in the magazine, and that was a great experience to be able to deal with high-level mental health professionals and really understand how to tell these stories, part of which ended up in this book that I wrote, Bitter Pills, which is mostly about drugs. The last case I want to tell you about is a major case that had to do with infanticide, a woman from Philadelphia who had had 10 babies, all of whom died in childbirth. And we reopened this case in the late 1990s, and it turned out that she was severely mentally ill and that she had murdered all these babies. So after the piece came out, the piece was given to the police. They brought her in for questioning, and she confessed. And this set off, besides an international discussion about this case, an international discussion about all the kinds of things that can happen postpartum that are not being treated. So Mrs. No had what we believed was postpartum psychosis, but there are a lot of postpartum diseases that people don't know about. And in the middle of all this, I wrote The New Rabbi, which, since Lou Graffman's here tonight, at least somebody at Harzion has forgiven me for. And for many years after that, honestly, I did not write that much about mental illness. I was editor of Philly Mag for a while. I wrote The New Rabbi. I wrote other books. And then in early 2011, a mutual friend introduced me to Patrick Kennedy. It was not long after this really dreadful picture of him was taken. He had just left Congress. He was struggling with bipolar disorder and substance use disorder, addictions to opiate painkillers and alcohol. I didn't realize when we met in April of 2011 that he had only been sober actually for a few weeks. But he was also in love with a teacher from South Jersey. They were actually both living in her parents' house as he worked on his recovery. He was talking about an exciting new kind of brain health advocacy that would bring together mental health, addiction medicine, and neuroscience in a really creative way, using the brain trauma of recent vets to call attention to all traumatic illness, using their high rates of suicide to call attention to all suicides. He was also trying to convince the public that the new Mental Health Parity and Addictions Equity Act, which had been his signature achievement in Congress and the last bill his father worked on before his death, could be used to really make changes in the way that we view brain diseases. The law made it illegal to discriminate against these diseases in medical insurance coverage. But the hope was that this idea of parity was bigger than insurance. This is the first new modern narrative I had heard about mental illness and addiction in a long time. And one of the problems of being in this field, either as a journalist or as a caregiver, is how many times people come and tell you they're going to get rid of stigma, they're going to fix everything, and then everything's going to be fine. After a certain point, after so many decades of the brain, we're in the third one now, I guess, you do start to wonder. But I do think that this approach is new and is the right way to go, because beyond everything else, it has legal underpinning, and it's not just, one of the things that Patrick and I talk a lot about is when we first met, we talked a lot about waiting for people to understand that they needed to be nicer to people with mental illnesses. And I remember one time talking to Kay Jamison about this, and she said, stigma is crap. I don't want to hear about stigma anymore. This is discrimination. If you say the word stigma, it makes it sound like somehow it's okay, and it's understandable that people feel that way. And the sooner that we in this field start seeing this as medical discrimination, and not just something that's understandable, the sooner that we will actually make progress. So I did this piece for Philly Mag about Patrick and his wife, and after it, he asked me if I would consider doing a book with him. And so I decided I would do it, only if he let me write the book that I thought that I would read. So he wanted to actually write a kind of a pretty boring book, mostly about policy from some courses he was teaching at Brown. And I said, no, if we're going to do this, we need to use your story to its most powerful end. So I literally asked his office to ask for every medical record that had ever been generated in his case, none of which he had ever seen, and have them sent to me, so that we would go over them and really use his history of treatment as a way of really telling the story both of American mental health and addiction care, and also to cross-reference it with everything that was happening politically, some of which happened before his time in office, but all of which I thought was incredibly important. At the same time, I was working, as Elliot mentioned, on a book on Benjamin Rush. And I'm always reminded, and I think it's important to remember, that these issues are as old as modern care for mental illness and addiction, which began in Philadelphia in the late 1700s. That's when Benjamin Rush first talked about mental illness and addiction being medical and not being because of weakness or because of spiritual problems. He did this as the founding father of American medicine at Pennsylvania Hospital. And he also struggled with issues of the appropriateness of where religion fit into medicine and where religion fit into government. So he's a great person to think about these things and get you started. We also spent a lot of time looking at the beginnings of the politics of this in the 1960s. As some of you know, President Kennedy signed in 1963 a bill that everybody thought was going to solve all these problems, make them all go away, the Community Mental Health Act. He said the mentally ill need no longer be alien to our affections or beyond the help of our communities. And of course, we are still struggling to make those words reality. I did a lot of work with Patrick besides working on this book. This is actually a picture of me at the Senate Judiciary Committee, listening to Patrick not give the speech that I had just spent 3 weeks writing for him. Because the thing is great about Patrick is he's great on his feet, and the minute he gets a microphone in front of him, he totally throws away the script in front of him. So if you want to read what I wrote, it's in the congressional record, because they actually put what you write in the record, not what they say. But this is I always love this picture, which was taken by a staff photographer somewhere. It really captured what my life was like at certain points working on A Common Struggle. But the book finally came out. It was an immediate bestseller, although I am still amazed at how many people have not read it. And I think that a lot of people who read it because it was a Kennedy book, not because it was what we meant it to be, which was a book that would really bring together his story and the story of the Kennedys' work to really explain to people what the history and the challenges of mental health are. And I mean, part of the problem in this field is that it's so hard to get up to speed, both on what's already happened, what the gold standard of care is supposed to be for what you have. It takes a really long time. It could take your whole life. And so we finished the book, and it just so happened that not long after that, I met Elliot. And I thought about the kind of writing that I was going to do now that the book was over and I wasn't writing as Patrick anymore, or for Patrick anymore. And the first thing I thought about was faith-based communities. I mean, it's sort of the new rabbi meets a common struggle, right? And I really felt that, interestingly enough, I think that sometimes the things that we rely on faith communities for, of having old-fashioned values that other places don't, sometimes those old-fashioned values include stigma against mental illness. So if we want people to return to our houses of worship, we want them to access the Jewish communities more and other faith communities more, I think we probably need to be able to do a lot better in these areas. And there have been some efforts to this end. The American Psychiatric Association in 2014 brought together all these people from around the world to try to create a new faith-based initiative and then didn't spend any money on it afterwards. There was a faith-based initiative within the suicide prevention world. But as I talked to Elliot, what I realized was that this was not going to come from the top down. In reality, what was going to have to happen was that individual congregations who wrestle with these issues privately, every clergy member wrestles with a certain amount of completed suicides, a certain number of drug overdoses, and the ongoing fear that the people in their community who either are getting mental health care or not getting mental health care, that something terrible will happen. Because these are the only diseases that we don't talk out loud about. So if you have cancer, everybody knows, you get your mishaberach, everybody asks how you are. But if you have these diseases, we still do not know how to talk about them at a very basic level. So I thought that Elliot was very brave to let me use his brother's story. I mean, here's a story that's 34 years old. 44 years old, I'm sorry. But for everybody who grew up in Harrisburg, I mean, it still makes us gasp the same way it did the day that we found out about it, as it should. Because in reality, we do not process these deaths. We do not process these illnesses. That's part of the reason that there's stigma. We do our best to deal with them, but our best still isn't good enough. It can be better. So I wrote this story that appeared in the foreword right before the high holidays in the hope that it would do kind of what it's done, which is get a lot of rabbis to think about maybe this year is the year they're going to do something better or something more about mental illness. And again, I don't think that they can do everything overnight, but you cannot come to this. I mean, this story came out in September. I think it's even worse now, to be very clear. Every day you open up the newspaper and you see the unbelievable ravages of mental illness and drugs. The opiate overdose rates are just astonishing. You have to look pretty far away to not think that it's time for us to rethink some of these things. And I will say sadly that when I wrote this article, we thought that there would be a different administration coming into office with a more open-minded point of view about this, and since there isn't, I think it's even more important for faith communities to step up themselves, especially powerful faith communities like this one, who can really make a difference just because of the power of their interests. So I want to walk you through some basic steps of what I think can be done and really then open up to a conversation. So what can be done to eliminate discrimination and stigma against brain diseases? How do we make the Jewish community, or any faith community, including both its religious and its more secular institutions, a place of more comfort and support for people with these illnesses and families dealing with their consequences? First, we do what we're doing tonight. We admit there is a problem, and it is one we usually address, if at all, only when it is too late after someone has died from suicide or overdose. Admitting that the problem does not only affect them, those people who are different than us, but impacts all of us every day. There's no family in our community that is not touched by these medical issues. There's no medical problem that isn't exacerbated by these illnesses. Secondly, I think that we can try to make immediate progress in 3 key areas. We can increase inclusion, first in subtle ways, by simply even reminding congregants before the Mishaberach and the silent Amidah that those prayers for healing apply to acute and chronic illnesses, and even specifically note that they apply to mental illness and substance use disorder. The power of just saying that out loud over and over in a community could be unbelievable to the people who never hear that they are included. Congregations can also, and this is starting to happen around the country, schedule annual Sabbaths of inclusion for mental illness and addiction. Remember, we used to have those sisterhood Sabbaths when we were kids. I'm looking at Debbie because our mothers were involved in these things. There's a lot of hairdos. What I'll say is those sisterhood Sabbaths seemed utterly ridiculous to me, and they were so backward in terms of whether these women were actually part of the community. So if you remember that our moms couldn't even stand on the bimah then, they had to stand down front and sort of pretend that they were included. So women, at least in my shul, and this shul, are fully included. But people with mental illness are still like our moms with the hairdos in the 60s, waiting for somebody to tell them they could be part of this. There's also ways even to embrace individual prayers. One of the things that I had a great experience with was interviewing Rabbi Bradley Artson in California. He wrote one of the most famous interpretations of the Amidah Prayer for his son who had Asperger's. And he looked into it based on the idea that the Amidah Prayer was about healing, and he knew that his son was not going to not have Asperger's. So that it was important to change individual words in the prayer so that he was not asking for something that was not evidence-based. So evidence-based prayer may seem like a weird idea, but we want evidence-based everything. So in this congregation, by the way, and the rabbi and I had a conversation about this just the other day, they've actually made a really interesting little tweak to the Mishaberach. So the original language of the Mishaberach, the phrase at the bottom, Refu'ash HaNefesh, or Refu'ash HaGuf, is usually interpreted as complete renewal of the body and spirit. And now they are using the language complete renewal of the body and the mind and the spirit. Now that's a little change, but it's a little change that signals that it matters that people who have brain diseases are not included. We can increase knowledge about the illnesses and how we still discriminate against them, sometimes unwittingly. When I'm done, we're going to hear a little bit from Maria Boswell. Maria's from the Department of Behavioral Health for the city, and she is one of the many people who is trained to give trainings in what is called mental health first aid. Mental health first aid is an 8-hour program. It can be broken up into two 4-hour programs that has been used all over the country, all over the world, really, to try to familiarize people with the basic illnesses involved in brain diseases, the basic approaches to their care, and the basic approaches to emergency care, so that when we have conversations about these illnesses, we are not starting at scratch, and that people can get beyond the things that they think they're supposed to be debating, which they aren't. We will have sign-up sheets here afterwards for people who would like to take the training here at the synagogue, and it will be scheduled at a convenient time for you, and we hope that many of you will do this and many of you will tell your friends about it. Mental health first aid is funded by the federal government. It's considered the only training like this that is really useful. It would be great if there were many more of them, but this is really the established one. It's put out by the National Council on Behavioral Health. We can also increase openness about diagnosis and treatment. And when there are tragic deaths, and there are from all diseases, we can try to be more open about what led to them. There is no reason to be embarrassed by any medical diagnosis, including mental illness and substance use disorder. There's no reason to try and keep secret a suicide or an overdose. It won't stay a secret anyway. It will be on social media in 3 minutes. But our desire to try and keep it a secret will only prevent those grieving from getting the full sympathy and support they deserve, undermine the power of the loss to scare others into getting better care. There's actually a new trend in being more open in obituaries. It's actually happening in Pennsylvania for some reason more than other places, and being more open about the actual causes of death in an advocacy kind of obituary. Some of you may have noticed that, I don't know if Kurt Weldon was your congressman or the congressman from the next area below, but Kurt Weldon's son, Wayne, died of a drug overdose in the late summer. And the family was very clear about how important it was to point out that they would be transparent and open about his drug addiction, and that they wanted to make sure that people understood that this is how he had died. He was open about his illness when he was alive. And you were starting to see this more and more in obituaries and in services. Not every family is going to be ready for this, for that level of honesty immediately after such a tragedy, although having a more openness in the community would lead towards that somewhat. But keep in mind, there is no statute of limitations on the truth or the power for you and for others about being open about brain diseases. Just ask your synagogue president who came out to me and the forward to you after 44 years. I guarantee you that that was every bit as powerful to him, to his family, and to the people who heard that story as it would have been if they had told the story at the time. So I'm going to stop here. This is how you can reach me. We're going to take some questions, and then we're going to have Maria come up and talk a little bit about mental health first aid. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you so much for having this evening and for beginning, hopefully, this process for this community and for others. Thank you.
First of all, Stephen, we want to thank you for being here, for raising our awareness. We've taken the first few steps under your coaching and encouragement, and I hope now that we as a community can share our thoughts and our questions, especially our questions for you as an expert who's done such an incredible amount of thinking about this over decades. We have cards that David and Lenore are walking around because there may be people who have questions. We want people to feel as forthright in their questions as possible, even without sharing identity, that we're going to ask people to write your questions, and they'll go into the basket that David and Lenore have, and then we'll be able to share them in that way as well.
Great.
Okay.
We're going with the handheld.
Okay, so I'm just going to read what's on each of the things, and you can choose to, but this is without interpretation. Aren't mental illness and substance abuse two different things?
I would say yes and no, and I think that it's important to separate out how we think about them if you happen to be a researcher in this area, or whether you happen to be somebody who has one of these illnesses or is treating one of these illnesses. Because I think that what's happening more and more is the completely separate worlds of these two things, which came from a different period in science and a different period in treatment, is really a remnant of the past. So obviously every disease is different, but the comorbidity between mental illness and substance use disorder is so clear and so strong. I think that we now believe that it is impossible to treat addiction without treating underlying mental illness. And I think that the debate about where the line between one is and the other one starts is kind of useless. And I think it hangs people up. Part of what has kept people from addictions from getting actual treatment, so that they get rehab and then they are thrown out to only be able to go in a 12-step because there is no other medical treatment for them, has been the idea that there are two different kinds of treatment. For those of you who noticed, in the midst of all the elections, we did have a Surgeon General's report on addiction, which came out 2 weeks ago. What's fascinating about the Surgeon General's report on addiction is how much of the language is almost exactly the same as the Surgeon General's report on mental illness, which came out in 1999. So in reality, what we now know about addiction and mental illness is that both of them need to be treated acutely when somebody is at the point where they are suicidal or need to be hospitalized, need to be detoxed. People with addictions need to have medical treatment available to them. So it will come as a great surprise to many people that most people are now considered to be suggested to take medication after they have been detoxed and not go directly to just abstinence and sticking it out. That is something that you've probably seen stories about this, but in fact, it really hasn't sunk into people because most people don't understand that that's what they should be expecting from care. So what they should be expecting from care for mental illness and addiction is acute care, outpatient care with a combination of medications and therapy. And 12-step meetings are supposed to be the peer support, not the treatment. 12-step meetings became the treatment because there were no other insurance coverages for the treatment, not because it's better. Now, for the people who have been in AA for all these decades, who have been taking care of people because they have no other treatment, this is in itself a challenge. So you're seeing a number of different forces going on at the same time. But what's important to understand is that the gold standard of care for both of these illnesses has now become pretty common. They are different in terms of the different drugs you take based on your diagnosis, but there are certain drugs you take if you are addicted to opiates. There are certain drugs you take if you are addicted to alcohol. There are certain drugs you take if you're addicted to benzodiazepines. There are certain kinds of therapy that work better in conjunction with these. There is always the problem of when you go off these medications, which is a challenge in all of these illnesses. But we have to stop being surprised that this is the standard of care. We have to start demanding it from our insurance companies and from our caregivers. It's not perfect. It's not going to make everybody better in 2 seconds. But what is amazing about this area is how few people have ever had the gold standard of care. How few of them have had access to the psychotherapy that is clearly indicated in what their illness is. How few of them have had access to the medications that clearly have been shown to work for their illnesses. So while we focus on the future, we focus on what research can do to maybe cure some of these diseases, our biggest concern in the advocacy community is to make sure that a higher percentage of people just get the basic treatment that we know works. And at that level, the truth is that addiction and mental illness are not as different as they used to be, and I think you're better off thinking them as being together and not thinking that you're the exception if you have both or if a loved one has both. That wasn't a short answer, was it?
Perfect.
So what I'm going to do for this, as we're collecting more cards, there are threads. And so instead of repeating nuanced questions that are slightly different.
Okay, you're going to amalgamate the questions.
We're going to, yes.
Okay.
Yes. So
7 people asked.
this is for and counting. Wanted to know a little bit more about the shame and stigma piece. I'm going to just give you a little sense of what that means, whether it means that mental illness is hidden, whether, according to one question, to what extent is the stigma part of the sort of health insurance providers, the business of it, and whether coverage and avoidance of coverage and the business side of it contributes to or is a beneficiary of the stigma. A question about whether you feel that this shame and stigma has changed. Someone poignantly mentioned his or her mother who suffered from mental illness and was hospitalized, and the children, as children of this patient of mental illness, that they did not get a sense of how to destigmatize or remove the shame, and the sort of issue of anonymity, even the name anonymous in some of the support groups, AA and NA, whether that contributes to it. So that's an amalgamation of questions about that. And
Okay,
and
let me
one more. More.
Okay.
What can
I have a slide that answers all these.
And also, you mentioned the idea of at one point in time, cancer was similarly like this. Is this a process that we see?
Okay, I don't have a perfect answer to all these things. I've been covering this for a long time, and I can tell you some of my thoughts. One, writing about Benjamin Rush in the 1780s really brings a lot of clarity to one question, which is that all these issues of stigma existed before there was medical insurance. Okay, so I can rip a medical insurance company as good as the next guy, and I can rip a drug company as good as the next guy. I wrote a whole book about it. Okay, but if you think that the insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies invented everything that's bad about medicine, you really are living in a fantasy world. We do stigma ourselves. Okay, maybe it's exploited by those companies, but they didn't invent it. So I think that stigma, again, I do feel that I wish the word stigma didn't exist, because honestly, in most cases, what stigma simply is discrimination. And I think because of that, we are often afraid to say to somebody in our family or somebody near us or an employer, and we don't feel that we're on legal grounds if we say it to not get in trouble. So part of the reason that I am interested in this and writing about this is because I don't want people to just go out and say, like, let's fight all the family members who are being stigmatizing. I mean, I think we should also be talking about whether the Americans with Disabilities Act gives us the right to tell our employees that we can't say that we're crazy, and can't question that if we are being treated for depression, that there's something wrong with us, while somebody being treated for another illness doesn't have that. So it's really multidimensional. It's based on your own situation. So I think that each family has to grow as an open family. Every community has to grow. I mean, every community where the people are open about an existing case of mental illness and open about deaths from mental illness is different than a community that's never said it out loud. And those discussions can come in lots of ways. At Bethel, when Elliot's brother died, one of the biggest discussions about where he would be buried. He was the first person who had died from suicide who was buried in the main synagogue because the rabbi there felt that that was important, and the previous rabbi may not have done that because that would have been a risk. So what I would say is it's very complicated. You have to handle it in your own family. You have to handle it in your own workplace. You have to handle it in your own community. I believe that synagogues and houses of worship are places where you can send the word out in a bigger way. But I do think that we can't kid ourselves. I know many people who are told by their psychiatrists, don't tell anybody you have this illness. Now, that's old school thinking, but it's not based on nothing. So we have to be willing to be in a community where we are saying, you know what, this is the case, it sucks, it's been going on for a long time, you didn't do it, but maybe we're the generation who's going to do something about that. That involves legal strategies. It involves protections because some of it has to do with whether you would lose your job. Some of it has to do with whether you would lose in a divorce case if it was known that you had a mental illness. So some of these things have to be played out in those arenas. But I think if we take, one, the idea that this is discrimination, it's not understandable, and it's not legal anymore. Okay? It's illegal under the Mental Health Parity and Addictions Act, and it's illegal under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So let's not think that it's just something we should have to ask people, please be nice to us. We're saying these are our rights. At the same time, every individual person you talk to about this is hard. And they want you to be better. So in fact, every time that you're not better, they want to say something that they think will make you feel better, but in fact makes you feel worse. And I will tell you, being a family member in this situation, that I've written a lot of books about this, but I cannot pretend that I'm great at it. I happen to be in relationships where the other people could say, like, well, that's not exactly the most supportive thing you ever said. I think that we have seen this play through with cancer. We've seen it play through with other illnesses. I believe we can teach ourselves how to do this with mental illness, but we would have to talk about it more. And I think the biggest thing Patrick always talks about is the silence. So the biggest thing you can do, even if you do it badly, is just to not be silent and to not expect others to be silent.
There's a thread of questions about resources.
Mm-hmm.
Are there Jewish organizations that focus on programming for specifically Jewish consumers? Do you think it would be helpful for synagogues to be more open to allowing AA and NA meetings? And someone who shares an experience about working on a suicide and crisis prevention hotline and the idea how important it is to have sort of contact, that sometimes that's the only contact that people who are coping with mental illness and brain disease are that have is through these hotlines, and what resources can and should be available within and without of the Jewish community.
Well, keep in mind the Jewish community is a big place, and the synagogue is only part of the Jewish community. The Jewish community has always had Jewish family services, and other religions have had their versions of Jewish family services who have offered these kinds of this kind of care or access to these kind of care for people who cannot afford it through their medical insurance. I think part of the problem, and I know from writing writing the New Rabbi, I mean, the clergy don't always talk to Federation, don't always talk. So there's a lack of communication in those areas. But one of the things that these weekends of faith should lead to are resource guides. And I've been told that Philadelphia is the most backward city in the country in terms of having access to basic resource guides. It shouldn't be hard to figure out where all the inpatient facilities are and how to find out if they have beds. It shouldn't be hard to find all the different people who are covered by your insurance or who offer these things. But in Philadelphia, it is hard. So certainly what happened in New York last year, last year the mayor of New York and his wife, Charlene McRae, announced they were going to do a mental health weekend of faith for all faiths in the city. And as part of that, the Department of Human Service, the Department of Behavioral Health, was going to create the first useful resource guide that actually looked at everything, okay? Because it looks at the people who are wealthy enough not to let their kids be treated in a place where somebody can see them, and the other people who have to be treating them in a public place so everybody knows about them. So it's got to be for everybody, and part of the dynamic in the synagogue is that you have all different kinds of people. But the secrecy that some people use for the care is part of the problem. So if you think that you have to keep it a secret to get this care, that's going to add to that. But I think that this city could do better. I think the Department of Human Services is dying to hear the people in the main line care about this and would be interested in this kind of effort. It doesn't take that much money and it doesn't take that much effort to create a better network. Keep in mind, these people created all these networks before the internet. Today, if somebody wanted to set up a program where you could actually find out how many open beds there are in every facility in the Delaware Valley, you could do that. So, I think, honestly, with the new administrations coming, we better do that. Because the promises of the Affordable Care Act, the kind of easy coverage things that we've taken for granted, even just the first couple of years, we're going to have to fight for them, and some of them are going to go. So some of the things that you have lived with through 8 years are now going to be harder. So some of it is just about recognizing what the resources are, having central places for them, and recognizing, we talked about that a little bit at dinner, there's been almost no philanthropy in Philadelphia, at least open philanthropy, trying to solve these problems. I know cancer is bad and almost everybody in my family has it, but it's not the only disease that we can give money to. When am I going to see the mental health center at Penn? So I think that this is an area that philanthropy would be really good for, because getting access to services is a challenge. And in order for us to really understand the places where there aren't enough mental health professionals, docs, psychologists, social workers, where there are not enough inpatient beds and outpatient programs, you have to be able to have somebody looking over that. And I think that a community like this, without a lot of money, honestly, could make a huge difference. And because these are things that are not national. They are, every place is different. That guide would be different for Bucks County than it would be for Montgomery County, than it would be for Philadelphia County. But it can be done. That said, there are organizations within Jewish Family Services. I hope people do reach out to the Department of Behavioral Health, to Tikva, AJ, Joyce, sorry, I just said it wrong. But there are organizations that help people do this. You are not necessarily alone. This congregation will make some of them more available, but they need to be known in the Jewish community. They need to be known to the people who don't come to shul anymore and don't want to be part of the Jewish community, but need the help of the Jewish community, of which there are many. And that's true in other faith communities too. So I think that ideally this will be an organized thing with other faiths too, but what Jews can do is first look at their own Jewish communities to make sure that that their clergy, I mean, we talked about this too, to make sure their clergy gets the help in terms of what they need to know when somebody needs to be referred to mental health care, even though they want to come to the rabbi and get counseling for free, because they don't want somebody to say they're crazy and need mental health care. That handoff is really challenging. It's really hard. You could argue it's the biggest single challenge always, going from somebody who's having a behavior and saying this person has a medical problem and need help. That's always going to be the essential challenge. That's never going to change for every person. And every time they get better and relapse, it's going to be the same thing. That is the nature of brain diseases.
This is a bit of a more focused question.
I'll try to give a more focused answer.
No, I don't know what you'll have to say about this. This is a question about the connection between suicide and chronic pain. Whether the chronic pain, I'll just make sure I read this correctly, whether the chronic pain causes the mental illness, or if the mental illness was there first and the pain sort of was the exacerbating factor that brought it out.
Well, I'm not a medical doctor, but what I would say in general is that those kinds of debates are what keep people from getting care. You know, and we get caught up in these intellectual debates about whether you're going to answer that. I could find you 45 people to give you 45 answers to that. It will not help you treat your chronic pain or stop you from trying to complete suicide. So what we have to realize is that many illnesses in the central nervous system have as an end stage suicidality. Okay, suicidality needs to be treated and prevented itself. Okay, pain management is pain management. About, you thinking about taking your own life is a different set of symptoms and a different problem, and it has very actually well-prescribed protocols on how to deal with them that hardly anybody gets. Because people only think about these issues when they are piecing together why somebody completed a suicide, even though in more cases than we realize, it's all right there. So what I would say is those kinds of debates are great for people to have if they are in the field at professional meetings deciding how to spend the research dollars of the National Institute of Mental Health. They don't make individual people healthier. Pain management is hard. Managing people with suicidal ideation is hard. There are experts in each of those areas, and they actually are all really well acquainted with these challenges and with these issues. What is amazing is how little people talk to the doctors about it because they think they're not supposed to. But when I interview those doctors, it's all they talk about. It's all they talk about in terms of the challenge of that. But suicidal ideation, once any brain diseases get to the point where we are dealing with preventing somebody from commit suicide, there is a whole other set of circumstances here about which we are learning quite a bit. And there are a lot of different organizations that help with this. There are a lot of people who study this. I have a colleague at Columbia who only studies suicidal ideation. What it means, what it is, how it's different from different things. But I think that we have to recognize that suicidal ideation is a symptom. It's not real. It's not an existential truth. That's a really hard thing to convince people of, especially younger people. But part of that conversation is a way of saving lives.
Okay, so just to follow up on that, and then we'll hold on to this one as the last question for now. Though I do want to say that following the public piece of this, first of all, we're going to hear a little bit about mental health first aid.
Yes.
And then in the Frankel directly behind us, Elliot promised cake. That's the first thing that will be. And also, Stephen will be there after these couple of questions to sign books and to continue perhaps more personal interactions as well. So this is a question, we were talking about scope and sort of the interconnectedness of different manifestations of brain disease and central nervous disease. What is the definition and scope? Anxiety, ADD, anything that's treated by medication, things that are not treated by medication. What would be the in your definition scope of that?
Well, look, keep in mind, I don't want to insult all the people who are in this audience who treat patients every day to pretend that the journalist who comes and writes about these things has answers to these questions. What I can tell you is from interviewing lots of people and seeing the challenges of getting people to get the information they need to make smart decisions themselves, what I would say is that I think everybody wants to know the answer to that without actually going to a doctor. Because they think they can look at it on the internet, they can take a test in Cosmo, they can do something that will allow them to avoid this. The number of people who are given mental health drugs by their primary care docs because they don't want to be known as getting them from mental health professionals is shocking. It's not the primary care doc's fault, kind of, but in reality, every person who is being treated for depression but actually hasn't been diagnosed with depression is at risk because they are not being monitored in the medication they're taking. So my answer to that question is we have to stop thinking that we're supposed to answer this question. If you feel that these symptoms are reaching a point where they are interrupting with your life, that's why people go to school to learn how to be psychopharmacologists and psychologists and all the different kinds of training and spend the time to at least interact with a mental health professional to have that conversation with somebody who actually is a professional in it. Because it is amazing how much bad advice you can get from family members, how much bad advice you can get from the internet, and you don't even remember where you heard things. But the number of people that I interview, or the people who I interview who have lost family members, who think they were part of the medical community because they saw stuff on TV or read about stuff and they had heard from their Uncle Bob who had taken this drug and maybe they even took Uncle Bob's drug. It's astonishing. So part of the problem we have to have is, one, we have to have the coverage for this. I mean, I don't want people to have to go and pay out of pocket, and that is part of the problem. But we don't have enough people who are reaching out to the mental health system. And at the same time, I will say that because of that, and because of low reimbursements for people in the mental health system, we have a huge problem with not enough trained people coming up in the mental health system. So in many places in the country, there are not enough psychiatrists, there are not enough psychologists, there are not enough care professionals. And that's partly because we think we're supposed to have this conversation ourselves, and me and your wife and your mom are supposed to figure out what anxiety level is supposed to be bad enough. These are medical problems. Your primary care doc should be sending you at least for a consult from a professional, and you should be having that conversation based on some evidence beyond your own work on the internet, because these are also open issues. I mean, there are people who devote their entire lives to trying to figure out how to define the answers to these questions. Every time the DSM comes out, do you guys know what the DSM is? Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's published by the American Psychiatric Association. It's part of an effort the World Health Organization does to basically give a name and a description to every disease. So the World Health Organization does every disease. The DSM does every disease of the brain. So the debates about what these diseases are supposed to be called, what the threshold is for whether you have them or not, I mean, this is a difficult thing. So, and that's why there have been 5 versions of the DSM, every one of which has had a huge argument about it. The DSM-5 we're now arguing about. DSM 5.1 will soon be argued about. It'll be online. But, don't pretend. I mean, part of the problem of people denigrating mental health professionals and saying it's all crap is that they don't treat it scientifically. They don't treat it medically. So, and even primary care physicians can do that. So what's important is take your own health seriously. If it was a broken leg, you wouldn't ask your father what the threshold is. You'd get an x-ray. So maybe we need to be thinking more and more about how to medicalize. And when I say medicalize, it doesn't mean you have to see a psychiatrist. Medicalize means being treated by people who are mental health professionals in whatever area you require mental health professionals.
So there was another thing that was added to me which is a corollary to that, so I'll just acknowledge that there's another question out there about the increase in depression and anxiety in children and teens as also something that needs to be, I would imagine, characterized in the same way with mental health professionals and followed up.
Well, look, one of the issues about the increase in anything in mental health care is like what's the original number that you're comparing it to? So I think that these are, look, I'm part of journalism. We make money off these stories. But they're not good necessarily for care because they don't really apply to you. You either have it or you don't. It doesn't matter if there's an increase or a decrease. All the numbers that you hear in mental health care and addiction are all 2 and 3 years old. I mean, what's funny is, we're now in the situation with addiction where the 2014 numbers are coming out saying that addiction already peaked, even though we're pouring all this money into it now because before those numbers came out 2 weeks ago, we thought that it was on the rise. So keep in mind the numbers are the numbers. They control public policy at least until January 19th. Can't say that they will after that. But all those trends, what's really important, and I always try to share this with my colleagues because I teach mental health and addiction journalism, you have to be careful when you write about things whether you are encouraging people to stop treatment, whether you're encouraging people to feel that this is all a big joke and that there's no there there. There is a there there. It may not be as perfect as you want it to be, but guess what? If you covered cancer and you covered heart disease, you'd realize how imperfect their care is too. We just don't talk about that because we don't think it's okay to say that.
And this maybe is a good wrap-up question, sort of bringing it a little bit.
Does it involve cake?
Communally. Was that?
Nothing.
It says, often it is difficult to spend time with those who are mentally ill and not treated or not treated well. How can we train our communities to be more open, kind, and welcoming? So I think
that's a question that kind of answers itself in a way. I guess the easiest answer to the question is, if you think it's uncomfortable for you, imagine how uncomfortable it is for the person who's sick. And every one of us has been through situations in caregiving where somebody we were with was sick and difficult. Why are the people who are sick and difficult? Because a brain disease is somehow less worthy of our sympathy and our time. I just think it's because we are afraid and because of our silence. But in fact, I don't think it's that much worse, and I think these diseases are episodic. I mean, look, there are people with treatment-resistant schizophrenia who are never better. Those people are primarily in inpatient facilities because that's the nature of their illness, and that's horrible. That's every person's biggest fear in these areas. But the rest of it, all we can ask ultimately is, again, all the things that we do for every other illness, we don't expect better. We don't expect better coverage. We don't expect you to be any nicer to us. When people just had a surgery, they drive you crazy too. But the question is whether we see that as again, part of medical illness and part of something that we support the care of and that we believe in the process of the care, which isn't that easy, but it isn't that easy for all illnesses. And part of what makes it not easy is if you think that all mental illnesses are made up. And you read too many stories in the media about how this person's faking this or this. I mean, those of us who are in this field who cover it and who treat patients are interested in reading about these trends. And some of the trends are shocking. The overuse of antipsychotics in children, the diagnosis of bipolar disorder in 2-year-olds. But it doesn't mean that there aren't 2-year-olds who have serious illnesses that need to be treated. And we have to be careful when we read or talk about stories that basically, that the moral of the story is all mental health care is crap, right? Which are the same as stories about pharmaceutical companies, being too profiteering or putting a drug out there that isn't good, and we say all medicine is crap. I mean, do we really believe that all medicine is crap? Do we believe that all surgery is crap because there are some unnecessary surgeries? Do we believe all pills are crap because some drugs are overprescribed? I mean, that is the danger of looking at medicine, from this perspective. And again, all I would ask is to bring that same kind of sense to the way that we view addiction, the way that we do mental illness, and the treatments for them. I'm not asking for anything more than that. Just the same level of tolerance and the realization every once in a while that, God, what did I just say? I really just said that all, because I'm mad at a drug company because a drug didn't work. I'm really saying I'm never taking drugs. Because guess what? After Bitter Pills came out, I met a lot of people who never took drugs again. Some of them because they read my book. I mean, that's horrible. I mean, that's not what I meant to do at all. I mean, the goal was to make people understand how this business works, what's good about it, what's bad about it, to bring a more sensible idea to it. And that's what we have to do with mental illnesses and addictions too. And every time you find yourself thinking that it's all so, there's just no way for it to be scientific and medical, it's because you're not sampling what's available. We would like to be able to make sure that you can.
I want to thank you because I feel that with that answer and with your talk, you have helped us as a community, not just the Adath Israel community. I see out here representative many cross-sections of our greater Philadelphia community, and I want to acknowledge those from Beth Shalom congregation who are here as well from across the river. That, thank you for that. But for the work that you are doing in your center at the synagogue. And I want to thank you for helping us take important first steps in this. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So before we have cake, I want to bring Maria Boswell up for 1 second, talk a little bit about mental health first aid. The feeling in general in our field right now is the biggest single thing that you can do in a day or two to really move forward your knowledge base, your understanding of how to deal with these illnesses and the people who have them, if you have them yourself, is to take this training. It's free, it's funded by the federal government in most places, and it is invaluable, and it is, I think that it's a consciousness building and a team building opportunity for any community. Many synagogues across the country are starting to do it. Many houses of worship are starting to do it. After the event that we talked about at Adath Shalom, they already started their training. It started last week. And I know Elliot and some of the others who are leaders here would very much like Adath to be the first synagogue on the main line to offer this training and to be a place that spreads the word that this is something important in all of our faith communities and houses of worship. So, Maria, can you come and talk a little bit about the training and how people can sign up for it either tonight or later on? No, go to the microphone. Do you hate microphones?
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. Trapped between you and cake. That's a horrible experience for a fantastic journalist and speaker and cake. Oh my goodness. And a microphone. Let me tell you very quickly about what the city of Philadelphia is doing as far as the training, mental health first aid. I have some resources out on one of the tables outside near the books and the cake that you please feel free to take with you. I just bought very general pamphlets and information about anxiety and depression, trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, mental health and aging. So I tried to just bring some samples for you of some different resources that the city of Philadelphia offers to anybody who needs to learn a little bit more. So mental health first aid, as you've heard today, is a one-day training where any person, a community member, somebody who may already work in the healthcare profession, can learn about the signs and symptoms of mental health challenges and addiction, look for risk factors, learn about protective factors, learn how you can listen non-judgmentally to somebody who may be struggling, how you can offer reassurance instead of that very tempting advice, how you can encourage professional help, and how you can also encourage any recovery support strategies, self-help strategies that may help that person. You do not leave this training with an additional medical degree or this complete understanding of what depression or anxiety may or may not be. But from everything that we have seen in our evaluations, people leave just a little bit kinder, a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more understanding of what it must be like to really struggle with something for a short amount of time or a long time. People learn about some of the basic and most simplest things that you can do. You spoke, Stephen, about, when somebody hurts themselves or they're physically unwell, that we're all, quick to take over our chicken soup. But I don't know how quick people are to take over that chicken soup when somebody has suffered a psychotic breakdown. We prefer to just wait until we see them out walking their dog and we say, oh, hello, I haven't seen you in a while, right? Because we don't really know how to address it. And I think the word stigma often, in my mind, is ignorance, really. So if you don't know something about it, most likely you'd be fearful. You wouldn't know what to say to somebody. So by taking a one-day training, again, it's just a one-day training, you learn some tools and techniques about how you might better approach somebody who is struggling. And this could be somebody in your very own family. Again, today we heard a lot about policies and changes and what may happen in our future governments. But I think my role here today is really just to take it then right back to that, to you, to that individual that you are, and to say that, change starts with how you speak to the person who's sitting next to you. So hopefully, with all the governmental changes that we spoke of, we have to think very positively that things are going to be good. But let's not worry about that for now. Let's worry about what we can do to be a little bit kinder, more compassionate, more understanding, and really just to reassure people that people can and do recover. Recovery is possible. Treatment is out there. There are many ways that people can seek help, from talking to somebody who has a shared lived experience all the way to seeking the most professional help that you can get through psychiatry and psychologists. So again, talking about mental health first aid, a one-day training that you can take, that I believe that we're going to offer something here. This is a beautiful facility. That would be a perfect training room, I'm just saying. And they will have cake that day. Will we have cake? Okay. So please consider coming to this training. Again, mental health first aid, to learn about the struggles a person may be going through in the very early stages. And then we also work to help you understand when something is becoming a crisis. There's approximately 3.5 hours of the training that speaks to the signs of suicide, how you can address this, how you can try to help that person, how you can speak to them. And it's also very interactive. So an example of an activity would be where we help you to see what it must be like to hear voices. And so we have somebody who acts as the voice into the ear of someone, and then another person trying to have a conversation with the person who may be experiencing voices. So you can really get the picture of how terrible it must be to be hearing many voices and then trying to have a conversation, but also how judgmental we are when we're talking to someone and we're like, why is this person not paying attention? What are they going through? And if you work in the profession of as a clinician, you know that we're so quick to write those notes about wasn't paying attention, wasn't listening. So if you are somebody who your profession is to help people with mental health challenges and addiction, we also encourage you to take this training to kind of take you back to those roots of why you chose to help people in the very beginning. We tell you to put your intakes and assessments and all the knowledge you have aside and really go back to what it is that helps somebody go from not getting help to holding your hand and taking them to that treatment, which really just, again, goes from everything that we've learned today, policy, practice, what's out there, to just human kindness. So if you'd like to take a human kindness training, it's called Mental Health First Aid. And again, I'm also going to be out there and happy to answer any questions. There's other people here who work with the Department of Behavioral Health in the city who I'm sure would be happy to answer your questions also. So I hope everybody had a good day, that you have a good evening, and that you all have coats for tomorrow's very cold weather. So thank you very much. Thank you.
So thank you, everyone, for being here. Directly behind us in the Frankel Hall, there are continued resources to find out more. Stephen will be there. The gift shop is open. The book is on sale, and Stephen will be able to sign it and also continue to interact with us. And yes, there is cake. Have a good evening and a safe evening.